Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second episode in our Standard Oil series. Of course, we continue looking at the life of Rockefeller and this incredible company that he built. In the first episode, we saw the first two parts. We see a little bit of the religious background in Rockefeller's life, how it provided the fuel for everything he's about to do in the oil industry. We got to see, of course, the industry itself, this chaotic, rowdy industry, susceptible to booms and busts, and how Rockefeller is trying to impose order. In this second episode, we're going to see Rockefeller cross the threshold and decide on his solution for order, how to wield the chaos of the industry. And for those who are willing to join him, this is a fantastic proposition, especially from the perspective of making money. For those who are not willing to join him, well, life will be ever more difficult as the Standard Oil empire grows and grows. We're also going to see the birth of the trust. This is critical as eventually, this world of antitrust legislation is really born of the actions that Standard Oil is going to take. And we're going to start to see a storm gather where people like Ida Tarbell, which we have seen a little bit so far, is going to go after Standard Oil. And eventually, the government is going to come for Standard Oil. That being said, let's jump right into episode 2. Part 3, The Covenant. In dark, smoke-filled rooms, hands are shaken, papers are signed, and an unspoken agreement is formed. It is not the free market. It is a game of control, of leverage, of foresight. The railroads bow first, granting one man and one company the advantage no one else can see coming. The competitors still believe they are in the same race. They have no idea Rockefeller has already built a track. It's around this time, somewhere, after Rockefeller becomes one of the largest refineries in Cleveland, perhaps the largest, that Rockefeller starts to see perhaps a different world. This is not the capitalism of competition, where, the most efficient, the most profitable organization will win. He sees a slightly different world, one where perhaps cooperation makes more sense. If everyone cooperates, then everyone can make money, and you don't have to suffer the losses. In fact, competition may be a negative element of capitalism. And he wasn't the only one. We're going to see something similar with the steel industry under Carnegie, where again, it's not really about being the best. It's more about how you cooperate with others, and perhaps you acquire others if they don't want to cooperate, because again, cooperation is so strong that anyone who doesn't want to cooperate should just be acquired and removed from the game, not beaten in some kind of fair way, quote unquote fair. And the first element where Rockefeller will start to seek cooperation will be the railroads. Now, railroads are important to our story because when the fight comes to Standard Oil, first from individuals like Ida Tarbell as journalists, and eventually from the government, the Department of Justice in particular, they're really going to center on the railroads, specifically the railroad rebates that individuals at Standard Oil, Rockefeller included, will receive to transport their oil. This may actually be the single most controversial aspect of the Standard Oil history. It's helpful to understand the role that railroads play at this point in time. Remember that cars are not existent. We're still in the 1860s. Cars will not be around for perhaps another 30 years. So that means that any kind of truck or transportation by roads is not yet available. In fact, it won't be until Eisenhower, post-World War II, that we're going to see the full development of the highway system in the U.S. This is in the 1950s. So the primary way to move items within the United States are railroads. Railroads are appearing all over the world. They were actually first seen in Britain, but the U.S. is going to fully embrace them. And again, in sort of typical American fashion, they will be developed in a very chaotic approach where single individuals sort of get grants to lay the tracks. And sometimes those tracks are actually conflicting with each other and they don't quite make sense and tracks are abandoned. So the railroad industry is also going to go through ups and downs as there is consolidation, as individual railroad businesses go out of business and so forth. But if you want to move anything from, let's say, Cleveland to New York is going to go through a railroad at this point in time. So the railroads exert influence, but that influence is limited by just the margins of their business, where you have this heavy initial cost to be able to lay down the railroads, and then you have to be able to maintain that cost, maintain the trains, and so forth. Now, for several years, Teamsters, these were the wagoners who hauled out the barrels, exercised a brutal tyranny and charged high sums. Now, since oil was relatively cheap and seen really as a standardized commodity, transportation costs eventually became a critical factor in the competitive struggle for everyone who was in this industry. So refiners like Rockefeller eventually started to seek out special rates from the railroads to be able to transport their refined oil, primarily kerosene, into the East, let's say New York, right, where it's then going to get exported to the rest of the world. For example, the official rate to transport oil was perhaps $2.40, and through special deals, special rebates, they could get that down to $1.65. Now, the rebates came through several means. One, of course, was volume. In some cases, Rockefeller and other refiners would promise a minimum amount of volume per week or per month. Another was to assume legal liability for fire and any other accidents, and to stop using water transport during the summer months. But the volume was particularly the most enticing incentive for railroads to provide these rebates. Eventually, Rockefeller would sign a deal that's sort of known as the Lakeshore deal. The Lakeshore was one of the railroads in existence at the time, where again, Rockefeller would promise 60 carloads of refined oil daily, a high amount, right? So Rockefeller started trying to get these rebates while also walking this fine line of, can we actually supply this amount of refined oil every day? It's also, of course, going to create incentives for Rockefeller to go and get more refining capacity and more crude oil. So you can start to see how all these things are starting to play together to create this massive organization of which Standard Oil would be known for. This Lakeshore deal is clearly a turning point for Rockefeller and the oil industry in general. And again, Isla Tarbell, the journalist we're going to see very soon, she really condemns this as Rockefeller's original sin from which all the others spring. There's actually no written agreements with Lakeshore. The agreements that Rockefeller developed with the railroads were completely oral. So we're starting to see some behavior from Rockefeller that may not be completely aligned with his religious background. So he knows this may not be correct, it may not be legal. So let's perhaps not put it on paper. And again, this behavior is going to become more obvious with Rockefeller, where he almost creates this separation between himself and eventually some of the people that are working for him. He's aware of everything that's going on. He clearly has a high level of influence, but he's not deeply connected. He's not at the meetings. He's not having this conversation. He's not putting his signature on paper. So this, again, if this is the original sin, so to speak, it's objectively a good one because it kind of starts to foreshadow some behavior from Rockefeller and Standard Oil that we're going to see later on. Now, rebates weren't just solicited by shippers like Rockefeller. They were, of course, offered by railway freight agents eager to win over new business. And rebates allowed the railroad companies to maintain a bit of fiction of what the listed rates said while secretly giving discounts to other shippers. And again, Rockefeller is not the only one that's going to get rebates. Other refiners, other people in the industry will get it. But Rockefeller, as they get larger, and eventually Standard Oil as they get larger, they have more and more sway with railroads because they can offer more volume, better incentives. Eventually, Rockefeller is going to have stakes in railroad companies, and those stakes will allow even more influence over who gets rebates and who doesn't get rebates. Now, it's helpful to talk here about this railroads for a second. There's two arguments to this idea about rebates, and I'll give you both. You can decide which one makes the most sense to you. On the one side, Rockefeller argue from a strictly economic standpoint that if they provided more volume to railroads and in some cases guarantee daily or weekly volumes, they deserve some kind of discount, right? This kind of makes sense, right? Today, if you buy things in bulk, you're likely going to get paid less because you're buying it in bulk. So that's sort of the one argument for the rebates. In theory, everyone can get rebates if you're able to provide that volume. The reality, of course, becomes that as Standard Oil becomes larger and larger and they have more ownership of the oil industry. Keep in mind that at some point they're going to control 90% of this industry. The ability for someone else to provide equivalent incentives for rebates is going to be quite limited and diminished. On the other side, the individuals who argue against rebates claim correctly that for railroads to lay down tracks, they require state charters. So every single state, Ohio, and others, had to provide some kind of right of eminent domain. That is the right to claim private property in order to lay down the tracks. And thus, those railroads, even though they were private organizations, actually were investing with some kind of public character. So this benefits given by the state governments meant that railroads needed to behave a little bit differently. And they should be seen as what is called a common carrier. That is, they are moving things from point A to point B. Everyone should pay the same amount for this benefit, and no one should have special rebates because, again, they are not quite quasi-governmental entities, but they have sort of governmental duties from the rights they got to lay down those tracks, and thus rebates do not make sense. The concept of common carriers is actually still available today, right? You may have, for example, airlines, Delta, United, and so on, that they transport passengers and cargo. It doesn't mean they don't have rebates and so on, but again, they're sort of seen as common carriers and they have some certain regulation that applies to them. Bus services like Greyhound, Megabus, maritime shipping like a Maersk or MSC, the Mediterranean Shipping Company. Then you have telecommunication companies like AT&T, Verizon, and of course, utilities perhaps are an even better example of electric, gas, and water providers that have special government regulations that allow them to provide the service, and thus they have some limitations on what they can and cannot do. So this debate on the railroads will go on from any time. Eventually, there's going to be legislation, the Interstate E-Commerce Act in the late 1800s, that's going to do away with rebates, though, again, in practice, rebates will continue. I guess you can see it more of a legal loophole. But the rebates are going to become important for Rockefeller. Eventually, the overall weight of Standard Oil will make it difficult for anyone else to get rebates. And in some cases, there's actually recorded instances of railroads losing money to carry the refined products from competitors based on the deals they struck with Standard Oil. That is, they somehow have to end up paying Standard Oil to carry the oil of competitors. So rebates are going to become big, and they will be dissected in a lot of detail by journalists later on in our story, specifically Ida Tarbell. But this is where they stand. So Rockefeller gets rebates, other people do as well, but clearly Standard Oil will benefit the most from them. Now, on January 10, 1870, is a special moment. The partnership that Rockefeller had to run his Cleveland refinery is going to be replaced by a joint stock firm called the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, with John D. Rockefeller as president, William Rockefeller as vice president, and Henry M. Flagler as secretary and treasurer. The name was actually supposed to advertise the uniform quality of the kerosene at a time when consumers feared bad quality. In fact, bad quality kerosene wasn't just annoying, it could actually lead to explosions of the lamp itself. And you can imagine that if a lamp explodes near you, like near your face, you're going to have some health consequences from that. So standard was meant to imply that there was a standard level of quality with the kerosene. Now, by this point in time, Standard Oil can be seen as almost like a mini empire. It really controlled about 10% of the American petroleum refining capacity. They had a barrel making plant. They had warehouses, shipping facilities, and of course, a fleet of 10 cars. And again, Rockefeller had this divine vision that one day Standard Oil might just simply refine all the oil and make all the barrels. This point in time, 1869 into 1870, was really the start of Rockefeller's campaign to replace competition with cooperation, as we saw at the beginning of this part. In 1870, Ida Tarbell describes Rockefeller as cautious, secretive, seeing all the possible dangers and, of course, all the possible opportunities, and studying, like a chess player, all the possible combinations that might limit the supremacy of Standard Oil. Now, 1872 might be seen in two ways. For the admirers of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, this is sort of seen as, the greatest year of Rockefeller's life. And for his critics, it really constitutes the darkest chapter. Now, there are a couple of things that are going on at this time in 1872. Let's start to kind of sort through them. One, on January 1, 1872, the executive committee of Standard Oil made a decision to purchase certain refining properties in Cleveland and elsewhere, a seemingly normal resolution, but it's going to become the opening shot of a skirmish that some historians have come to label the Cleveland Massacre. Now, around this time, there's also another innovation called the South Improvement Company, the SIC, where members of this organization would receive drawbacks on shipments made by rival refineries. That is, the railroads would give the SIC members rebates for every barrel shipped by other refiners. Again, sort of try to wrap your head around this, right? So if you join the SIC, of course, Standard Oil as part of the SIC is likely the most influential member. And Standard Oil, as a member of the SIC, could then receive a 40-cent rebate on every barrel is shipped. This is the shipping rebates, plus another 40 cents for every barrel shipped to Cleveland by competitors. This is where all of a sudden railroads are starting to pay Standard Oil, I guess initially the SIC members, by shipping non-SIC members' oils. In another provision, SIC members would also receive comprehensive information about all the oil shipped by the competitors, invaluable when it came time to underprice them. Now, the railroads, in return for agreeing to all these terms, would get some kind of level guaranteed traffic, right? Some minimum number of volume. And the SIC was dividing the traffic among three railroads: the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Erie Railroad, and the New York Central. Now, Rockefeller was also doing other things to motivate railroad companies to agree to this kind of deals. One factor that is, I think, just fascinating is Rockefeller started to accumulate hundreds of tank cars. This is the cars that would carry the oil on the railroads itself, right? And by accumulating all these tank cars, that is, he was buying these tank cars, he could all of a sudden make the tank cars appear in short supply to any railroad that perhaps wasn't willing to come into this agreement. So if you were, let's say, I don't know, the New York Central Railroad, and you don't quite want to join this SIC agreement, well, you might find that it's a little hard to get tank cars. Somehow they're in a little bit short supply. You can't really get them. You can't really buy them. So this is just sort of another way that Rockefeller is trying to influence railroads to provide the rebates and provide the special provisions that he wants. Now, we have to argue here that the Rockefeller wasn't trying to bankrupt railroads. I mean, I guess this might change depending on your perspective. Railroads, again, is just a very difficult business. And Rockefeller simply believed that by everyone cooperating, everyone could make money. There would be sort of minimum amounts of numbers, minimum volumes for everyone, the railroads, refineries, and so on. And everyone will benefit. Everyone, of course, being whoever's sort of part of this deal. If you're not part of this deal, then maybe you're not benefiting. But it kind of falls under this belief of cooperation, not so much competition. Now, the SIC would fail. It's actually going to have this incredible backlash, as you can imagine, in the oil regions. For many of the oil refineries, that is, people who were not Rockefeller, I guess maybe even Rockefeller, they really saw that their ability to refine oil was some kind of God-given right. It was in their own backyard, and nothing could get in the way of that, especially no sort of larger institution, no government could kind of get in the way of that. So the SIC is this huge affront to the liberty of the individual producers that are trying to make a living in the oil regions. Now, this period with the SIC, where all of a sudden, anyone who's not part of the SIC started to say, hey, we have to pay other refineries to ship our oil. They're going to get a bunch of our information about our shipments, which is going to allow them to underprice us and a bunch of other things. One of the individuals in this huge mess is Ida Tarbell. Remember, right? Her dad was making barrels initially for the oil producers, and then he actually gets into the refining business himself. So she is seeing his dad deal with all these difficulties with this, rising SIC evil with Rockefeller sort of behind the scenes. She's seen her dad sort of struggle with it and be stressed and try to maintain their livelihood as a family. And even as a young girl, she kind of gets to know the names that are causing all this stress to her father. The names of Standard Oil, the names of the South Improvement Company, the SIC, the names of Rockefeller. Now, this is also where we start to see Rockefeller maintain such confidence, even when there's backlash. He sort of sees himself as this instrument of higher purpose, as we mentioned earlier. He's been endowed with a visionary faith, and he believes that his actions might be at first resisted, but eventually he will be accepted, right? Because he sort of has a higher purpose behind him. Now, the SIC will fail. It's just there's too much backlash. Everyone will back away from it. The railroads will not go into the agreement, and the refiners themselves will not join this SIC concept. But Rockefeller is not going to let sort of this bad PR go to waste. Between February 17th and March 28th, 1872, this is really when the rumors of the SIC appeared, and then they were scuttled as so much backlash caused the SIC to go away. During this time, Rockefeller actually swallowed up 22 of his 26 Cleveland competitors. During one 48-hour period alone in early March, he bought 6 refineries. So he started to consolidate, right? His realization, the realization of cooperation is that cooperation is the way to go, but other refineries may not actually want this cooperation. They may not be willingly going to this cooperation unless he actually buys them out and takes full control of the refinery. And he's going to consolidate all his power initially in Cleveland with the refining capacity. Then he's going to just repeat this over and over again until they control a significant portion of the industry. Now, something that's interesting here is that one might think that if you're going to go through this process, if you're going to try and buy out your competitors, perhaps you should start with the small, vulnerable firms that, may be struggling, maybe not making as much money. But Rockefeller actually believed otherwise. He actually started at the very top. And he believed that if he could crack his strongest competitor first, it would have some kind of tremendous psychological impact, which I think was true. So he would go from the very top and then go to the next strongest competitor and the next strongest competitor. So by the time he gets to like the 10th competitor, they're all seeing everyone else be acquired and join the sort of the Standard Oil team. So why not join themselves? Now, it's clear that Rockefeller was gifted with high persuasive powers, but it is intriguing to see what made him persuasive. He actually preferred to talk earnestly to his rivals, tapping them on the knee or gesturing with his hands, sort of reasoning with them in this sort of richly cadenced evangelical tones, right? That divinely appointed vision that he has for himself, he's talking about it with competitors. One competitor actually said, quote, he knew that that is Rockefeller and his associates, had a better knowledge of the business and a better command of the business than anyone else. You never saw anyone so confident as he was. One of the tactics that Rockefeller used during the persuasive negotiation was actually to open the books to the competitors. So all of a sudden the competitors go in, see the books, and they would realize that, hey, Standard Oil not only is so efficient, they're able to refine oil at much cheaper or lower cost than competitors. Standard Oil could completely undercut them to the point where the competitors will not make money and Standard Oil will still make money. So the idea that Rockefeller is actually so good at business that all he has to do is show the competitors how good he is at business, that was one of the most persuasive elements for competitors to sell to Rockefeller. Now, as you can imagine, the outcome of selling to Standard Oil had different responses. Rockefeller actually offered stock or cash, and he was actually always disappointed when refiners took cash instead of stock. He believed so strongly that if they took stock, they would be wealthier than they could ever imagine, and taking cash was actually the short-sighted action. We also got to remember, of course, that taking cash was more difficult for Rockefeller. He had to provide the cash. In some cases, he didn't have the cash. He had to go get loans to provide that cash to acquire a company. So it was just difficult from a cash flow perspective. But he was also sort of disappointed, right? That divine vision said that, hey, you should really stick around because in 5-10 years, your stock is going to be worth way more than whatever cash you get now. And on this, he was right. Over and over again, we see stories of people who simply sold their refiners for cash, or in later on, when they sold their Standard Oil stock before it became worth even more. And the stock is going to continue to be worth even more until Standard Oil is broken apart in a later episode. Now, some refiners who, of course, surrendered their faith in the oil's future, they resented Rockefeller. One of the reasons why is many of those refiners were just not making money. They were not well run. So when they were appraised by Rockefeller, they were perhaps appraised less than what the refiners thought it was worth, even though, again, they were just not well run. And we have to remember, too, that one of the goals that Rockefeller had in this period wasn't simply to run all the refineries he acquired. He was actually going to shut some of them down. He actually ridiculed many of these refineries as old junk, fit only for the scrap heap. It's not obvious if Rockefeller sold some of these refiners. That is, if he paid less than they were worth. I think the overall evidence shows that he probably paid a fair price. But for the people who sold, they did not believe it was a fair price. They could be worth more, but they weren't as efficient. They weren't as good as a refinery business as Rockefeller to be able to prove that on a just financial basis. It's also interesting to know here that, during this period of time and really later on in Rockefeller's life, he really didn't sound like a capitalist as we might describe him today in our sort of modern image. He really sounded more like Karl Marx, right? Where he believed that a competitive free-for-all eventually gave away to monopoly, and the large industrial planning units were the most sensible way to manage an economy. Now, Rockefeller, of course, had faith in private monopolies versus Karl Marx, who had more faith that a government could eventually run those monopolies more efficiently. After this refinery sold to Standard Oil, they were forced to sign restrictive contracts that prohibited them from sneaking back into the oil business. Rockefeller considered these agreements sacred, right? And there's many instances of refiners actually breaking the agreements and sort of, again, using the word sneaking back into the refinery business. Not everyone sold to Rockefeller. Of course, we can see that of the refiners that sold to Cleveland, there were maybe about 5 left. And this is going to continue on in different cities. This is actually eventually became a part of the Standard Oil strategy, where they realized that, hey, if you controlled 100% of the industry, that doesn't quite look so good, especially when the government starts to kind of look around to see what's going on. So perhaps 90% is good enough. It's a significant portion, it's a significant monopoly, but it's not 100%. And for many of the refiners that did not get outright bought, he actually brought them in with an intermediate step that he called run-in arrangements, in which Standard Oil guaranteed them a certain level of profits if they accepted a ceiling on their output, which, of course, makes Rockefeller and Standard Oil a classic cartel. This, Standard Oil was then able to restrict the output of the entire industry through the refineries they own and through this run-in arrangements. And he's doing this 100 years before OPEC. In fact, in many of these arrangements, Standard Oil will become the swing producer. That is, if there was a need to increase production or to decrease production, Standard Oil could then sway in any kind of way to make the market or whatever sort of price target you want to do. Today, in OPEC, Saudi Arabia plays the role of the swing producer, where they can sort of raise production or lower production depending on what's needed. I actually love reading how Rockefeller saw the actions that he was taking during this period of time where he's acquiring all these Cleveland refineries. He uses phrases like, the Standard was an angel of mercy reaching down from the sky and saying, get into the ark, put in your old junk, which we might shut down because it's not worth running. We'll take all the risk, right? He sort of referred to Standard Oil as the Moses who deliver the refineries from their folly, which have wrought such havoc in their fortunes. It's also helpful to note that Standard Oil was always seen as sort of this cooperative commonwealth, open to any refiner who was willing to renounce their quote-unquote selfish ways to join the faithful, that is, to join Rockefeller. It was, almost seen as Rockefeller's unique case, the strong, that is Rockefeller, showing mercy to the weak by inviting them to participate in a common effort to save the industry. You can imagine that before long, of course, Rockefeller was detested in the oil regions, especially as he started this conquest to assimilate everyone that he could. And it's actually possible that after 1872, he never actually visited the oil regions himself again. Not that he probably had any desire to visit. This is clearly not his vibe. This is not where he wants to go and spend time. But after this SIC period and this massive acquisition of refineries, he was likely not welcome anyway. Standard Oil, of course, then had to deal with the issues of running a cartel. One of them is how you deal with cheaters. That is when a refiner exceeds their quotas, what is the way you keep people in line, you impose fines or something else. There's also what's called the free rider problem. That is, there were opportunistic refineries that stayed outside of the Standard Oil world. That is, they had no running arrangement or they were not acquired. And they can enjoy higher prices without being bound by the production limits. And of course, anyone who did not want to cooperate, to Rockefeller's perspective, he sort of saw them as, he would say, quote, there are some people whom the Lord Almighty cannot save. They don't want to be saved. They want to go on and serve the devil and keep on in their wicked ways. Now, Ida Tarbell, of course, through her relationship with her dad, sided with the refiners who did not want to sell to Standard Oil, who wanted to remain free and independent. She's going to do a fantastic job dissecting the Standard Oil business, but her bias is clearly seen. She's going to almost like paint a revisionist view of the industry at the time. She's going to evoke this sort of paradise of free and independent producers in Pennsylvania who were ruddy and joyous men, enamored of competition, who were then sniffed out by the sinister Standard Oil. She's going to have this sort of morality play where Rockefeller was this venomous snake, right, in the garden of earthly delights. This is not completely true. As we saw before, the world wasn't really so much about competition, but about how you can make the most amount of money. And if someone else loses, then so be it. I mean, if you drill down into your neighbor's lot, then hey, that's your neighbor's fault. He should have done the drilling first. And the industry was not this sort of joyous environment where everyone was sort of shaking hands and having fun. This is a quite cutthroat industry. And we have to remember here that Rockefeller wasn't necessarily trying to bankrupt these refineries. He saw the bigger evil to be the booms and the busts. And he was trying to prevent prices from getting too low where everyone loses by trying to bring cooperation and keeping some people in versus, of course, anyone who doesn't want to join in, then they get to lose out. Now, by early 1873, Rockefeller, of course, had crossed his own Rubicon, if you want to use this phrase, and never looked back. Once embarked on a course of action, he wasn't really a man to be hobbled by doubts. And around this area, actually, in Pennsylvania and then elsewhere, Rockefeller was regarded as a monster. Especially, you can see, of course, in the example of Ida Tarbell and her household, right? Mothers would scold their children by saying, "Run, children, or Rockefeller will get you." Now, Standard Oil is no longer just a player. It is the dealer controlling the game. But leverage breeds resentment. And those who control too much, too quickly, eventually draw attention. A storm is coming, and the first signs of resistance are beginning to show. Part 4. The trust is born. An empire is not built in a day, nor is it built by chance. Brick by brick, pipeline by pipeline, refinery by refinery, the machine grows. Standard Oil is no longer just a company, it is a system, and quickly becoming a force of nature. Across the country, rivals find themselves surrounded, suffocated, erased. And for the first time, whispers of concern begin to rise. Is this company unstoppable? Now, Rockefeller is, of course, accumulating wealth as all this consolidation starts to happen. He was always suspicious, though, of any kind of boasting or ostentation among associates. One day, he was actually riding on a train in Cleveland when his companion asked him who owned this sort of handsome, dark green hillside house in the distance. Rockefeller looked at it and said, you know what? It's actually our Mr. Hopper who makes barrels for us. That looks like an expensive house, doesn't it? I wonder if Mr. Hopper isn't making altogether too much money. Let's look into it. They went back into the office. They poured over the accounts and decided that Hopper's profits were excessive and terminated the contract with him. Now, for the firms that did not join the Standard Oil fray, they were, of course, faced with restrictions on what they could do. We saw how he would pressure railroads by accumulating tank cars and then limiting the use of tank cars to railroads that did not play. Standard Oil would then go do the same with barrels, right? If you didn't have barrels, you couldn't transport the oil. But generally, Rockefeller preferred patience and reason, if possible, to terror. Not to say he wasn't using these tactics to terrorize competitors, but he much preferred people coming to the fold to see that coming into the fold meant more profits and cooperation for everybody. No need for this outright competition to see who's going to win. Now, Standard Oil and Rockefeller are going to repeat the Cleveland strategy in Pittsburgh. When they started this campaign, there were 22 refiners. 2 years later, only one was still in existence independently. It's interesting to see the competitors at the time kind of come across this invisible force. There's a story about New York independent refiners who were start to experience unaccountable shortages of vital supplies. This company actually manufactured petroleum jelly, suddenly discovered that it couldn't actually book the requisite railroad cars for crude oil shipments. There was something that was preventing them from doing this. Of course, Standard Oil was behind this. Now, eventually, Standard Oil is going to become so enmeshed in the railroad business that it's going to control virtually all the oil traffic that travel over the Erie and the New York Central tracks. Remember, these were two of the tracks that were going to join the SIC agreement earlier. Now, Rockefeller actually resembles the modern chief executive more than his industrial contemporaries. Rockefeller was responsible, of course, for policy questions and formulated the theoretical underpinnings of the trust, which we're going to see very soon. But he actually didn't introduce many of the technical innovations associated with Standard Oil. Rather, he was a matchless executive, with this crazy monitor of the stream of proposals that came to him daily from associates. And he had this extraordinary ability, a judgment really, to discern the best options and then go with those. And of course, we know his obsession with efficiency allowed the Standard to become ever better at refining oil, transporting the oil, selling the oil. He actually anticipated the efficiency studies of the Frederick Winslow Taylor, which we saw in the McKinsey episode. He regarded each plant as infinitely perceptible. He really created an atmosphere of ceaseless improvement, maybe even foreshadowing what the Japanese would do later on in the car industry. Now, of course, paradoxically, the increasingly mammoth scale of the Standard Oil operations actually encouraged close attention to the minute detail. Because if you saved a penny in one place, you then might be able to multiply that 1,000-fold throughout the entire empire. Here's one simple example. Rockefeller was inspecting a Standard plant in New York City that filled and sealed 5-gallon tin cans of kerosene for export. He was watching the machine solder caps to the cans, and he asked the expert, how many drops of solder do you use on each can? He said 40. And then Rockefeller asked, have you ever tried 38 drops? The man replied, no. Then Rockefeller asked him if he would mind trying some of the cans sealed with 38 and then let him know. When 38 drops were applied, they realized that actually a small percentage of the cans leaked, but none of the cans leaked at 39. Hence, 39 drops of solder became the new standard instituted at all the Standard Oil refineries. That one drop of solder, Rockefeller said, saved about 2,500 the first year. But of course, the business kept increasing and then double, quadruple, and that single change became immensely greater than it was then. And the savings has gone on steadily along one drop on each can. Now, he wasn't cheap though. He always believed in building Standard refineries with only solid, substantial plants, even if it meant higher startup costs. This may also explain why he really didn't agree with, the refineries that he bought and they had to be shut down, because he thought they were just crap. They weren't built correctly. They weren't built with the right materials. Why would you keep them? You might as well do something right the first time rather than try to fix it later on. Now, the increase in number of refineries that Standard Oil controlled then allowed new tactics to evolve. For example, when a competitor refinery didn't agree to join Standard, all of a sudden, he could idle out, for example, all the Pittsburgh refineries and then increase the output in the Cleveland refineries. Or he could lower the prices in one area, let's say in Pittsburgh, and increase them in Cleveland to make up the loss in business. So from this perspective, he could control prices in a specific locality and affect, let's say, the New York Independents, but not actually lose money, because somewhere else in the empire, the pricing will go up in an equal fashion. Of course, after 1872 and 1873, really, there's not a lot of barrel of oil that can get to a railroad without Rockefeller's consent. That's sort of the level of control that he's starting to enforce on the industry. And 5 years after the Cleveland Massacre, remember that's 1872, so we're in 1877, the 38-year-old Rockefeller had come to control nearly 90% of the oil refined in the U.S. Now, perhaps 100 tiny refineries still eked out a meager output in the sort of outskirts of the industry, but they were mostly tolerated as minor nuisances, and they weren't really a threat to Standard Oil. In fact, they were actually useful to prove that competition still existed in the oil industry and the Standard Oil was not a monopoly. Now, around this time, there's going to be the laying down of a pipeline. Now, pipelines were used in different places, but a pipeline called Tidewater became a particular concern to Rockefeller. It was meant to undercut Rockefeller's control of the railroads, and Standard Oil did everything it could to halt the Tidewater pipeline. There were, of course, bribes and extortion to political leaders to prevent the issuing of the right charters for the Tidewater pipeline to be laid down. It's important to know that Rockefeller and his associates did engage in a wide, staggering amount of corruption, like many of his peers. Some of the papers and some of the things Rockefeller has said seem to deny this, but there's an abundance of evidence to show that there was a deep relationship between Rockefeller and the political leaders of the different states where they operated. The Tidewater pipeline continued despite the pressure from political leaders, again, being sort of encouraged by Standard Oil. What's incredible about the Tidewater episode is just before the Tidewater pipeline was going to go live, and seen as this viable alternative to the railroads and effectively to Rockefeller, Standard Oil managed to strike a deal with Tidewater. And instead of cutting rates to compete with the railroads, it would actually collude with the railroads and raise rates. And within a year of its completion, the pipeline that was supposed to provide independence to the refiners that did not align with Standard Oil was actually brought into the pool that also included railroads that was supervised by Rockefeller. So it's just incredible to see. Here's a pipeline that the Rockefeller fought aggressively with everything they could. And then at the very end, instead of sort of letting it go and become a competitive element, they just simply took it on and made it part of this wider business that was part of the rebates. Now, in 1879, on Christmas, Standard Oil rescinded many of the shipping rebates that they had been using. And they actually met with many producers at the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York. And they claimed to move away from the use of secret rebates and drawbacks and consented to publicly posted freight rates. Its pipelines, including Tidewater, will no longer discriminate against shippers and transport oil within reasonable limits. This was actually done because there were a rise in criminal and civil cases against Standard Oil, in Pennsylvania in particular. And Standard Oil was actually trying to get rid of this legal troubles by seemingly starting to cooperate with non-Standard Oil refineries. What's interesting is that this removal of rebates and drawbacks did not actually fully materialize. It seemed to be a tactic to get the legal cases to be dropped, but the rebates and the drawbacks actually continue on in a slightly different format. Now, when Rockefeller turned 40 on 1879, he was already a number among America's 20 richest men, but he was likely the most obscure of that group. He was, of course, not the kind of person to go out in the public spotlight, but he also resided in Cleveland up to this point. He's going to eventually move to New York to a famous address at 26 Broadway, but he's still in Cleveland. So he's not as well known to the rest of the country, at least for anyone who's not in the oil industry. Talking about 26 Broadway, this would become one of the most famous business addresses and really a shorthand for Standard Oil itself. It would kind of evoke its mystery and power and efficiency. It's a structure of a plain gray stone, solid as a prison, towering as a steeple. It's kind of cold, forbidding cascade seems to rebuke, the heedless levity of the passing crowd. It is said that, men would point at the 26 Broadway building, glance quickly at the rows of sort of unwinking windows, nudge each other and hurry onward, just like perhaps the Spaniards used to do when they used to walk by the offices of the Inquisition. Now, the office had, of course, some unusual security features, including ground glass partitions that reached to the ceiling and obscure the proceedings within. In a sort of quintessential Rockefeller touch, the doors were actually equipped with a special secret rim locks. You had to know how to twist the rim with the thumb and forefinger before turning the knob, so that an intruder could find himself suddenly trapped in a maze of locked doors. This is where the trust comes into existence, so it's helpful to talk about it. Now, we know Standard Oil was a joint stock company by this point in time, but in 1879, the company of Standard Oil was running into issues. Under its charter, the Standard Oil of Ohio, which technically was the legal name, could not own companies outside of the state. So it assigned 3 mid-level employees to serve as trustees who held stock in a score of other subsidiaries outside of the state. And when they received dividends, they distributed them to the 37 investors of Standard Ohio as individuals in amounts proportionate to their stakes in the parent company. Now, this sort of jerry-built structure enabled Rockefeller to swear under oath that Standard Oil of Ohio did not own property outside of Ohio, technically true, even though it controlled most of the pipelines and refineries in Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. But remember, the trustees owned these properties, not the company. Part of the issue here was that the relationship between states was a little trickier at this point in time. That is, they were almost always treated as different nations. Like if you were in one state to another, there were all these rules that prevent you from operating in the other state. Now, one of the lawyers for Standard Oil at the time came up with an interesting idea of how to meld this intrastate firms into some kind of interstate giant. The first step was to set up a separate Standard Oil company in each state in which it had major interests. As a result, we get Standard Oil of New York in 1882, we get Standard Oil of New Jersey, and we get a few other ones. This will be relevant because when Standard Oil will get broken apart, this individual state Standard Oils will become the pieces that are left behind. Now, this tactic was designed to prevent each state, whether New York or Ohio, from properly taxing Standard Oil for property that was located outside of the state. This new agreement of the sort of state-level companies will become known as the Standard Oil Trust Agreement. There really wasn't much known in the public about this. I mean, it's kind of like a bit of an obscure legal matter, but this Standard Oil Trust led to the creation of a $70 million enterprise at the time that controlled 90% of American refineries and pipelines. And the public did not know about this until it emerged accidentally in antitrust hearings 6 years later. Now, the agreement created a board of 9 New York-based trustees, the group that assembled daily for lunch at 26 Broadway. Of course, Rockefeller was one of these 9, at least for some short time. Today, we will call it a holding company. But at the time, it kind of seemed more like an imaginary entity, right? It didn't have any real legal existence. It couldn't make deals, sign contracts, or keep books Though it wielded infinite power, it received the stock of Standard of Ohio and 40 other companies, 26 of them partially, 14 fully owned, with the power to name their officers and directors. Now, among the shareholders of this new trust company, the distribution of power and wealth remained lopsided, with Rockefeller holding more than 1/3 of the trust certificates, a block worth around $19 million at that time. Now, the trust agreement also allowed the sharing of gains and profits among everyone who participated. And this sort of converted Standard Oil into a true holy crusade. Rockefeller actually hoped that this new trust arrangement would form the model for a new sort of populist capitalism marked by employee share ownership. This was actually partially true. We're going to see this trust arrangement actually play out in many other industries, the U.S. Steel perhaps being one of the most prominent ones. It's going to become so popular that there's going to be a new law enacted in 1890 called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And we can actually see the birth of the Standard Oil Trust with a direct link to that legislation. What's incredible here is that this actual Standard Oil Trust is perhaps one of the first multinational corporations selling kerosene around the world and establishing a business partner that, honestly, for everything Rockefeller did and will do with his foundation, may be his greatest feat of all. Of course, Rockefeller can be seen as sort of the single most important figure in the shaping of the oil industry, maybe even in the shaping of the history of America's industrial development and the rise of the modern corporation. And so, Standard Oil, the trust that's at the heart of our story, is born. Standard Oil is going to have a high level of dominance for some time, at least, for the next 10 years or 15 years or so. And then things are going to change slightly. Their dominance will become more obvious, and enemies will arise fully equipped to take on this massive empire. But for this point in time, the machine runs smoothly. The chaos of the past is gone, replaced by a system so vast, so efficient, that nothing seems capable of stopping it. For the first time, Standard Oil exists in the world it controls, a world of stability, of certainty, of peace. But peace is fragile, and in the distance, a storm is gathering. Part 5. The Promised Land. The goal has been reached. The industry is his. The chaos is gone. Prices are steady. Machine functions. The world depends on Standard Oil. It fuels the cities. It lights the streets. It moves the trains. It is in many ways a blessing. Proof that Rockefeller is disciplined, his faith in order has prevailed. But when a man reaches the Promised Land, he often finds that others see him not as a prophet, but as a tyrant. We are at an interesting point in our story. After so many years of chaos, of acquisitions, of ruthless backroom deals, Standard Oil is really at the pinnacle of power. Now, foreign markets were always larger and more lucrative than domestic markets. Some 70% of American oil went abroad in the mid-1800s. And Standard Oil has benefited from the ability to export the refined products from oil. Now, the domestic market is growing and is, of course, going to become even more significant as time goes on. But we have to remember this inclination as things are going to start to change, particularly externally first, before they change internally. Now, in the early 1800s, 1880s to be specific, 85% of the world crude oil production was still extracted from the Pennsylvania soil, making it America's fourth largest export. And only Russian oil was starting to constitute a serious competitive threat. Some had observed that oil had really found its way into more nooks and corners of the civilized and uncivilized countries than any other product in business history, especially one that had emanated from a single source. Now, oil, of course, is going to be discovered in other countries. Canada will discover it in 1858 in Ontario. Actually considered one of the first in North America, but it just never really quite took off in the way Pennsylvania did. The major competitor to arise in this era before the next century will be Russia, who's going to find us somewhere in the 60s to early 70s. Oil production is going to begin in Baku, now Azerbaijan, and it was part of the Russian Empire at the time. And by the 19th century, Baku is going to become one of the world's top oil-producing regions. If we fast forward just a little bit, Iran is going to find it in 1908. Of course, this will be under the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which will later become BP. We saw this company briefly in the Dubai episode. Mexico in the 1910s, Venezuela in 1914, and then, of course, by that point, we kind of start to get into sort of the Dubai, Middle Eastern story where, Iraq, 1927, Saudi Arabia, 1938, Kuwait, 1938, Qatar, 1940, and so forth. It was intriguing that for the perspective of the Standard Oil executives, one of the reasons that the Russians didn't constitute a serious competitor until much later on than when the oil was discovered was because they did not consolidate the industry in the way Standard Oil had done so. The Russian industry was sort of closer to that free capitalism that we may imagine. And thus, it never really got organized against Standard Oil. So it took quite some time for the Russian oil to become a threat to Standard Oil. Now, everything about the Standard Oil operation is really colossal. It's kind of helpful to go over some intriguing facts. There were about 20,000 wells that poured their output into about 4,000 miles of Standard Oil pipelines, carrying the crude to a seaboard or to about 5,000 Standard Oil tank cars. The trust, now employed about 100,000 people and superintended the export of 50,000 barrels of oil to Europe daily. You could really only discuss Standard Oil in superlatives. It was the biggest, the richest, the most feared and admired business organization in the world. Now, Rockefeller was still involved at this point in time. He arrived at work each morning, he sat at his roll-top desk and examined 2 stacks of paper, one representing decisions made, the other matters to be thought over, and he slowly burrowed his way through both piles. Now, by this point in time, Rockefeller has maintained this sort of secretive approach to the trust. He really cultivated this sort of spare, elliptical style of writing, devoid of names or specifics that would have baffled any prosecuting attorney. And of course, we're going to see a bunch of attorneys be baffled by the exact role that Rockefeller is playing inside Standard Oil. He was effectively running the trust while simultaneously sidestepping responsibility, maybe erasing potential incriminating evidence, and of course, avoiding contact with any potential victims, anyone who's not part of the Holy Crusade. We know that some of those agreements with the railroads were, of course, oral, right? There were no written documents that confirm the specifics of the deals. But he did know everything that was going on, and by this point in time, at least in our history, in the 2025, we can document it, right? There's an abundance of documents that confirm his active role in the trust during this time, right? We're in the 1880s into the 1890s. Now, in his memoirs, that Rockefeller will go on to write as seemingly a way to change the PR image, he implied the Standard Oil took no rebates after 1880, but his files that we have available now disclose that the collusion with railroads became even more brazen after this date. It continued using sort of different products and tactics to ensure that the deals continue on. The trust actually owned a subsidiary called the Galena Signal Oil Company, which monopolized the manufacture of high-grade railroad lubricants. And this company could simply stall on shipments of this indispensable grease to remind the railroads that they should be aligning themselves with Standard Oil. Standard Oil, of course, was so large that it would split its territories. Kind of intriguing, it kind of split the regions, almost like royal charters. Kind of reminds me of the Hudson Bay Company episode where we saw the British king sort of take apart this huge piece of land, a good bulk of Canada and part of the US, and just give it to one company. Standard Oil kind of does the same thing, right? Kind of looks at its entire territories and says, hey, you, Standard of New Jersey, you own this part. You, Standard of Indiana, you own that part. And it's sort of just splitting things, right? I mean, it controls 90% of the industry. So it kind of gets to determine what happens in each region. Standard Oil marketing men were known to trail competitors' wagons and undersell them if necessary. This sort of unseasoned drive, this impeccable need to win, really came from Rockefeller himself. Even if he had this sort of quiet demeanor about himself, he had to win. He had to be the best. He had to bring everyone to the fold. And the ones that did not come into the fold, they might survive, but they were still going to be operating within his influence. Rockefeller also fostered an extensive intelligence network, assembling thick card catalogs with monthly reports from field agents, showing every barrel of oil sold by independent marketers in the territory. One Cleveland refiner discovered the Standard paid his bookkeeper $25 a month to provide information on his shipments, mailing this trade secrets to Box 164 at the Cleveland Box post office. Now, station managers were expected to command at least 85%, and if possible, much more of the oil trade in their district, a punishing Standard that sort of goaded them into aggressive tactics. So even if Rockefeller's not explicitly saying, hey, you guys have to go out and get all the market share you want, by whatever means possible, the incentives that were created within the trust led to questionable behavior. Again, behavior that Rockefeller was aware of, but wasn't necessarily as interested in stopping. Now, we have to know here that Standard Oil did do an excellent job at providing kerosene at affordable prices. It simply boasted far lower unit costs than competitors and relentlessly drove costs down over the years, and many of those improvements were passed on to consumers. Standard Oil, of course, created the model for the vertically integrated oil giants that are going to straddle the globe in the 20th century. That is, an oil giant that is interested in exploration, in production, in refining, in marketing, all in one location. A journalist popularized a name, Octopus, to help readers understand how Standard Oil was sort of in everything. And several journalists were claiming that Standard Oil was threatening free competition, which was true, of course, right? Standard Oil did not believe in competition. They believed in cooperation. They even made claims that perhaps Standard Oil was jeopardizing democracy itself. Perhaps this might be a bit of a stretch. Now, Standard Oil was engaged in corruption with senators and congressmen, money changing hands. This area was particularly corrupt, perhaps compared to modern areas, but this was part of the game, so to speak. It was expected, and Standard Oil and Rockefeller engaged in it wholeheartedly. There were different events where testimony was given in front of Congress, in front of the Senate, regarding Standard Oil. John's brother, Frank, actually, who held a grudge towards John D. Rockefeller for all his life, really. Perhaps more of a sad story. It really seems like John and his second brother tried as much as possible to help his third brother, Frank, and it just did not work out. But Frank did spend a lot of time actually going on testimony against Standard Oil. And Rockefeller was forced to keep quiet, effectively, while his brother was out there testifying to all the things Standard Oil was doing. Some things were true, some things were exaggerated. We're going to have Senator John Sherman. He was a Republican senator from Ohio, and he was a strong believer in free competition and feared the growing power of monopolies, especially the kind that trusts had, like Standard Oil. Now, he sponsored what became known as the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. It was really the first federal law to outlaw monopolistic business practices. But the act didn't really have teeth. Courts were slow to enforce it. It wouldn't be until the early 1900s, under President Theodore Roosevelt, that trust busting will become much more impactful. And in fact, the Sherman Act is going to use its power against Standard Oil and effectively lead to the breakup of the trust. But 1890, when it's passed, it is not a big issue. In fact, Rockefeller would go on to support the re-election of Senator Sherman in 1891, despite him passing the antitrust law. Now, by this point in time, the late 1880s into the early 1890s, the country sort of polarized on Rockefeller. Half wants to lynch him, and the other half wants to sort of get a loan from him. One 1889 newspaper article showed that Rockefeller was America's richest man with a net worth of around $150 million, an estimate he regarded as much too high. And of course, newspapers love to talk about how much he earned per hour, sometimes that number being about $750 an hour. in a world where the average hourly rate was much lower. Now, at this point in time, Rockefeller is also trying to deal with the difficulties of so much wealth. Every conversation he had at dinner, if he was out walking in public, would somehow turn around to his money. People would write to Rockefeller the way sort of small children pray to God for presents. He would get thousands of letters from all over the world asking him for some money, for a loan, for an investment. There was one boat that brought 5,000 letters from Europe. And after Rockefeller announced a large educational gift, he received 15,000 letters during the first week and 50,000 by the end of the month after that specific announcement. So he's receiving thousands of inquiries of people who want his money in some shape or form. Some are just individuals, some are organizations, some are nonprofits. It's a lot, right? At this point in time, Rockefeller is dealing with everything himself. He's going to eventually hire someone. This kind of predates the Rockefeller Foundation, but he's trying to figure out how to deal with this huge wealth that, of course, is talked about all the time in the press, which just sort of fuels the fire of the requests he gets. Now, remember that he saw himself as a tool of God. He had been given money because he had been sort of pre-selected, sort of special in the eyes of God. So he was also the person who needed to dispense of this money, right? He was the Lord's fiduciary, and he had to make sure the money was well invested. So every request had to be taken somewhat seriously. You had to sort of look at it and at least think about it. But this is quickly becoming unsustainable for Rockefeller. Now, he's going to partially retire in 1897, and he'll stop going to 26 Broadway altogether. This is actually going to be very important, as the period where Standard Oil would get broken apart, Rockefeller will not even be part of the company. But before 1887, there were a few things that sort of kept him tethered to the business for a few years. One was the depression heralded by the June 1893 stock market crash. This is actually originally labeled the Great Depression until the title was given to the economic period of the 1930s. Rockefeller is actually going to play a critical role in the stock market crash, that is, in helping rebound the market, providing money to different bankers. By this point in time, Standard Oil has a lot of money, and then they have also anticipated another major feature of the 20th century economy, the tendency of sophisticated or cash-rich corporations to outgrow their traditional bankers and become financial service giants in their own rights. So Standard Oil was really a bank of the most gigantic character, a bank within an industry that was constantly lending vast sums of money to needy borrowers on high-class collateral, just as other banks were doing. So Rockefeller actually personally provided money during the stock market crash of 1893 to help prop up the market and avoid a total collapse. He provided almost $6 million to 58 individuals and firms who were turned down by banks and desperately needed his intervention. Now, after the economic crisis of 1893, he proceeded to still stick around for a little bit more. And again, 1895, 1896 are likely sort of watershed years where, he's completely sort of phasing out of the company and fully retired by 1897. It seemed like the business had ceased to amuse him. There was a lack of freshness, variety, maybe had become irksome, and he withdrew, right? I mean, by the time you control 90% of the market, what else is there to do from sort of Rockefeller's perspective, right? He already has this incredible wealth that he's struggling to disperse. Standard Oil is this huge corporation. It might not be like that forever, but is there a need to keep going further? And remember that the public backlash was growing, and the rumors of legal troubles were also becoming more possible. Now, what Rockefeller accomplished in oil became a template for other industries: steel, copper, rubber, tobacco, leather. And many of these corporations were becoming trusts in the same way and eschewing the belief in competition and really adopting the belief in cooperation. This is becoming troublesome for consumers. Of course, politicians are seeing the strengths and thinking, we don't know about this trust thing, right? The 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act doesn't quite have teeth, but the concerns about trust are not dying down. They are increasing with time. Now, when Rockefeller retired from his business in 1897, the average American was earning less than $10 per week Rockefeller's average income, about $10 million per year in those glory days before income taxes. Remember, that's actually not a thing at this point in time. Just defy public comprehension. Now, today is intriguing, because I think we do hear vast amounts of wealth being generated and destroyed in short amounts of time, even at the individual level. But Rockefeller might be one of the first individuals who's doing this in the public eye, and the numbers just seem wild. Maybe there's a sense of, we have seen this before when we look at modern individuals. I think that people like Elon Musk and so on. So Rockefeller is really a pioneer in this area, and it's definitely polarizing the country. Now, throughout this, of course, we know that Rockefeller was not someone to flaunt that wealth. He was comfortable with himself. He really needed no outward validation of what he accomplished. And it seems he's ready to retire, to go spend his time at home in the different houses that he has, spend time with his children, his grandchildren. He's sort of ready to let go of the business. He'll maintain some involvement. And of course, the people who will be running Standard Oil after his retirement will come to see him and talk to him. But he is starting to detach. He's starting to enter a different period in his life. Now, it just so happens that this period is going to coincide with other things that are going to prevent him from moving on and making a clean break. Now, in 1887, his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., is going to graduate from Brown. And his son is going to become an important person, not quite in the Standard Oil story, but in the Rockefeller Foundation story. Eventually, his son is going to run the entire foundation. Rockefeller will be succeeded by John D. Archbold, his protege, who actually confronted Rockefeller back when Standard Oil was acquiring all the independents. John D. Archbold has completely crossed over, and now he leads Standard Oil. He's a little bit different than Rockefeller. Rockefeller was more reserved, preferred to do things behind the scenes. John D. Archbold is going to be much more confrontational and definitely much more combative to the critics and enemies of Standard Oil. Now, one error that Rockefeller committed in his retirement phase is he never publicly announced his actual retirement. He never said, I'm stepping down from the business. I am no longer in charge. And he actually retained the title of president of Standard Oil of New Jersey. As a result, he's going to remain an inviting target for critics and is going to be personally liable for many of the questionable judgments that will take place under Archbold and the other individuals who are going to lead Standard Oil post 1897. John D. Archbold is actually going to be the vice president of Standard New Jersey. Now, in a way, Rockefeller's retirement in 1887 is going to assume the nature of almost like a Greek tragedy. Just as he's trying to remove himself from the trust, its legal troubles are going to deepen. Now, of course, the press and the public both mocked his so-called retirement as a ruse to be able to evade testimony. For many people, they just simply could not imagine that someone like Rockefeller could just walk away from his creation and be done with it. Rockefeller is going to be brought in for different testimony during many legal troubles before the actual final trial that we're going to see in a second. And he's very calm under pressure. When he's on the witness box, he's going to speak in a low voice. People are going to strain to hear him. And he's going to concede so little that some newspapers will run headlines that look like, quote, Rockefeller imitates a clam. Rockefeller would show this amazing virtue of forgetting, not being quite sure of what happened in some years versus other years. He's going to completely resist any pressure from lawyers to provide details about rebates or negotiations with railroads or anything like that. In fact, you're going to put him on the stand and it would just seem so frustrating because he just doesn't seem to know anything. He doesn't seem to know exactly what's going on or what's actually happening. Now, to be fair, as time goes on, post-1897, he will have even more evidence that he actually doesn't know what's going on. He's no longer involved in the day-to-day operation of Standard Oil, but nonetheless, he does have an incredible ability to go under testimony and not lie, but not provide anything useful either. Now, at this point in time, the late 1890s will really be the peak of the Standard Oil empire. It marketed about 84% of all the petroleum products sold in America, and it pumped a third of its crude oil. the highest percentage it ever reached. And just to show the influence, there are quite several major events where Standard Oil is somewhere in the background. When Henry Ford rolled out its first vehicle, Charlie Ross, a Standard Oil salesman, stood by with a can of Standard Oil Atlantic Red Oil. The number of registered automobiles in America is going to leap from 800 in 1898 to 8,000 in 1900. This rise in cars is actually going to make Standard Oil even wealthier. Kerosene is a great product, but gasoline is even better, and it just has way more demand than kerosene. Now, when the Wright brothers took off from Kitty Hawk in 1903, their first flight was actually powered by gasoline that was brought to the beach by Standard Oil salesmen. And of course, within the business world itself, virtually all American industrialists were converts to the doctrine of cooperation preached by Rockefeller. However, on September 14, 1901, President William McKinley is going to be assassinated. One of the few U.S. presidents that has been assassinated, like JFK and so on. And at just 42 years old, Theodore Roosevelt is going to become the youngest president in U.S. history. Though not the youngest elected. That was actually going to be JFK at 43, much later on. He's going to serve from 1901 to 1909, and he's coming in with a trust-busting mindset, at least publicly. For Archbold and the people who were running Standard Oil, now that Rockefeller is gone, they see the federal government as a meddlesome, inferior power. And this is going to be a challenge. Now, Standard Oil has reached the pinnacle. It is the oil industry, it is the market, and it is the law in this industry. But every empire, no matter how powerful, must face its reckoning. And for Standard Oil, the reckoning will come from a pen, a courtroom, and a government that has had enough. And that's it for everything in episode 2. We have one more episode next week. We have seen Standard Oil at its pinnacle of power, and now we get to see the other side of the hill. In the third and final episode of our Standard Oil series, we get to see the government rise up under Theodore Roosevelt. Antitrust lawsuits will finally take hold, and Ida Tarbell is going to write one of the most effective dissections of Standard Oil that have ever been written by anyone. All the public backlash and all the enemies have gathered to take down the giant Standard Oil. My name is Ruben Ugarte. I'll see you here next week for the third and final episode of the Standard Oil series.